everyone, and welcome to this this last day of this event NG112 from theory to reality. I see that we are already 78 people who are on time actually for this call, so we can start now, and hopefully some the people who will join later will catch up. So this is the last day of our event on NG112. Hopefully you were also with us in the first 2 days where we discussed first all you need to know about NG112, and then yesterday we had some concrete some sharing of experiences from concrete implementations of NG112 or NG911 across the pond. So yeah, that's I just showed you the program, and if you've missed some moments of the first 2 days, no worries, you will be able to catch up a bit later, because this event is recorded and everything will be shared with you on Monday next week. So you'll receive the presentations and the recording of the event, so you can always listen again to the presentations if you want to. So today, as I said, this is the last day, and we will be discussing basically the next steps on implementing NG112. So how can we do it, who should do what, and when. So that's on the menu for today. As for the first 2 days, there's a possibility to ask questions. So you can see on the tool that we're using that there's somewhere where you can either post a message or ask questions. So feel free to use that tool, and we will be sharing then the questions on the chat. So no worries, and you can also just also react to the presentation. So feel free to interact with us, and we'll be able to then address your questions or your concerns. So I'm Benoît Vivier, I'm Public Affairs Manager at EENA, and in the past day you've also seen my colleagues Cristina Lumbreras, Technical Director at EENA, and Mr. Freddie McBride, who's Director of Digital Communications Policy and Regulations at EENA. We've been moderating these events during these 3 days, and these are pictures of when we were younger, from a few years ago. Hopefully we haven't changed too much. And yeah, so here today we'll first listen to Etienne Robelin, who's manager for emergency services at the Canada Radio, Television and Telecommunications Communications, which is the regulator in Canada, and who will present to us the perspective from a regulator when implementing next generation 911 in Canada. And then we'll come back to Europe, where I will be joined by my colleagues Cristina and Freddie to discuss basically who should do what and when to implement NG112, and to basically reflect concretely on what are the next steps after this event. So I'll first give the floor and introduce Etienne Robelin. Etienne, you work at the Canada Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. So welcome, Etienne, and especially it's quite early for you in the morning. So good morning and thanks for joining. The floor is yours, Etienne.
Donc merci encore, Benoît. So my name is Etienne Robelin. I'm the manager of the Emergency Services Policy Team at the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, which will abbreviate to CRTC, or the Commission throughout. It's quite a mouthful to say every single time. So on this call today, we'll also have Mylène Germain and Joel McGrath, my 2 senior analysts, as well as Landon and Alex, 2 of my engineers on my team here. So over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be providing an update on Canada's efforts to implement NG911. So we'll provide a brief introduction on who the Commission is, first off, and the role that we play in 911 governance. We'll discuss our approach to NG911 and some of the related initiatives, and then conclude with our current status and some lessons learned. So I don't want to assume that everybody knows what the CRTC is. So what the CT is, first of all, is that we are an administrative tribunal that regulates and supervises broadcasting and telecommunications services in the public interest, meaning that we are dedicated to ensuring that Canadians have access to a world-class communication system, and that their needs and interests are at the center of the system that provides those services. So our mandate is entrusted to us by the Parliament of Canada and focuses on achieving policy objectives established in the Broadcasting Act, the Telecommunications Act, and Canada's anti-spam legislation. So in terms of actual regulatory activities, here are a few that you can see on the screen that the CRTC as an independent regulator is involved in. So first, we promote and compliance with regulations, such as the unsolicited telecommunications rules, including the do not call list and Canada's anti-spam legislation. We approve tariffs and certain agreements for the telecommunications sector. We encourage competition in telecommunications markets to ensure that Canadians have a choice of innovative and affordable services. And we respond to requests for information and concerns about broadcasting and telecommunications issues. So to fulfill our mandates, we must understand the needs and interests of Canadians who make use of the broadcasting and telecommunications services. So as a result, we regularly hold public hearings, roundtable discussions, informal forums, and online discussion forums designed to gather Canadians' views about broadcasting and telecommunications services. That's information that we can then act on to serve the public interest. So within the context of 911 then, the CRTC's role in the regulation of 911 services falls under the Telecommunications Act. So under this act, the Commission regulates the provision of telecommunications services by telecommunications service providers, or TSPs. So in the 911 context, the Commission's role is to exercise regulatory oversight over the telecommunications access provided by TSPs to enable Canadians to contact public safety answering points, or PSAPs. So this oversight includes determining national policies, standards, conditions of services, agreements, eligibility to operate, and approval of tariffs for telecommunication services. The Commission also determines the use of 3-digit numbers, such as 911. There are others as well, 311, for example, for local information. We're working on a potential 988 as well for suicide prevention. That's still in discussion. We don't have a scope out for that yet. So we ensure that they are used properly and in order to maintain public confidence. And last but not least, we provide 911 information on 911 services to the public and to industry. So we often field requests for information on how 911 works in Canada, especially with the upcoming transition from current 911 networks to NG911. So in terms of our jurisdiction, so this diagram here is one that we usually present internally when introducing 911 concepts to new employees at the Commission, including new commissioners. So we'll revisit this again in future slides when we look at the transition from current 911 to NG911. But for now, we'll serve to illustrate the delineation of the Commission's jurisdiction. So you'll see here it's divided up into 3: originating networks, 911 networks, and 911 authorities. So beginning with originating networks, as touched on in the previous slide, the Commission's role is to exercise regulatory oversight of the access provided by TSPs to 911 services to enable communications between Canadians and PSAPs, wherever a PSAP has been established by the provincial, territorial, or municipal governments. So the Commission regulates the 911 access services offered by TSPs. Specifically, the Commission establishes regulatory policies, standards, conditions of service, and approves tariffs and agreements governing access by Canadians to PSAPs. In the middle there, you'll see 911 networks. So the Commission regulates the operation of related 911 networks by the incumbent local exchange carriers, or ILECs, who have been mandated by the Commission to provide originating network providers and TSPs with a wholesale 911 access service that enables them to route 911 calls and ancillary information over the 911 networks to the appropriate PSAP. Finally, there are the 911 authorities who answer the calls, right? So these are the PSAPs who actually answer the 911 calls, determine the nature and location of the emergency, and dispatch the appropriate first responders. So PSAPs fall under the responsibility of the 911 authorities. So those are the provincial, territorial, or municipal governments that I spoke of just a minute ago. So they're the responsibility for establishing and managing PSAPs and emergency response agencies have been delegated to those organizations, those local governments. So regardless, PSAPs are outside of the CRTC's jurisdiction. So that means that the Commission can recommend and encourage that PSAPs prepare for or do something, and the decisions and policies related to 911 may have an impact on PSAPs, but we cannot outright mandate them to do anything. So they're part of the 911 ecosystem, obviously, but as in terms of us actually issuing policy, it'll affect them, but we can never actually give them outright direction in regards to 911 affairs. That's not to say, though, that there's no collaboration or relationship between the Commission and PSAPs. So in order for us to fulfill our mandates, as I mentioned, we have to understand the needs and interests of Canadians who make use of telecommunication services such as 911. So one of the ways we do that is through roundtable discussions, which is where CISC comes in. So the CRTC Interconnection Steering Committee, or CISC, is a steering committee complete with formal guidelines and operating procedures whose mandate is to undertake tasks related to technical, administrative, and operational issues on matters assigned by the CRTC or originated by the public that fall within the CRTC's jurisdiction. So it's currently chaired by CRTC staff, so my director, Michelle Murray. And within CISC, there are a number of working groups that handle various matters such as numbering and business processes, all of which are public forums chaired by non-CRTC volunteers. So the working group relevant to this discussion within the CRTC is the Emergency Services Working Group, which we abbreviate to ESWIG, which is currently chaired by Mr. Chris Kellett. So the ESWIG is composed of TSPs, PSAPs, vendors, 911 industry experts, who all work together to address issues that relate to the provisioning of 911 services, as mentioned, including the technical and operational implementation of 911 services, as assigned by the CRTC or as requested by stakeholders. So for example, ESWIG addresses issues related to 911 transition considerations, 911 mapping data, 911 NG911 reliability, resiliency, and security, and additional data as well, just to name a few. So while not directly part of ESWIG's membership, Commission staff, such as myself, Milan, and Joel, participate in near daily teleconferences to provide some oversight and to ensure that discussions remain in line with Commission directives. So to recap all this, the CRTC establishes the policies related to 911, and ESWIG addresses the technical and operational aspects related to the implementation of those policies. So how did we go from all this to NG911 then? So our road to NG911 began in 2014 when the Commission recognized in its 911 action plan that the transition to internet protocol-based telecommunication networks was the way of the future, and then it could be leveraged to overcome limitations with our current 911 communication systems and modernize the way that Canadians interact with first responders when communicating emergencies. In the following year, in 2015, based on recommendations from the ESWIG, the Commission approved the adoption of the NEENA standard I3, the NEENA I3 standard for NG911, which I believe you're familiar with, being of the view that it will facilitate the transition from our legacy 911 systems to IP-based NG911 systems and provide a clear path for all 911 stakeholders and Canadians. And a couple months after that, again, in 2016, the Commission launched a proceeding to establish a regulatory framework for NG911. So this was a public hearing, meaning that any person or organization with an interest in the topic could submit written comments or appear and speak before the Commission in person to provide their views on next generation 911 and our transition towards it. So this led to our first piece of framework here. So in June 2017, the Commission published Telecom Regulatory Policy 2017-182, Next Generation 911, Modernizing 911 Networks to meet the public safety needs of Canadians. So it's quite a mouthful in terms of the name, but this was quite important as it was the first decision to impose formal obligations on TSPs and 911 network providers within the context of implementing NG911. And so we often refer to it as the NG911 Framework. So this is all available publicly, by the way. You can just go to Google, and if you type in CRTC 2017-182, this will appear, and it's available in both official languages, English and French. So some of the highlights from that decision were that the Commission noted that the current government's framework, which is based on direct Commission oversight over the ILECs as the 911 network providers, had resulted in Canadians being provided with a 911 service through high quality, reliable, resilient, and secure 911 networks. So given the importance of 911 services to Canadians, the Commission determined that it was in the public interest that the Commission retain direct oversight over these services, and that the governance and funding model that supports NG911 services must therefore include an active supervisory role for the Commission so that it can ensure that 911 services remain reliable, resilient, and secure, and that they are available to Canadians at cost-effective rates. Further, the Commission found that an approach based on Commission-approved tariffs would provide the Commission with the tools necessary to ensure that the funding of NG911 is provided at as cost-effectively as possible. So this approach would also ensure that funding is based on recovering the actual costs of building, operating, and maintaining the NG911 networks, and that costs are subject to the Commission's disclosure guidelines to ensure that they are as transparent as possible. So given all that, the Commission determined that an ILUC stewardship model under Commission oversight was the most appropriate with respect to the governance and funding of NG911, such that the ILECs will be responsible for building, operating, and maintaining the NG911 networks. So the Commission, through all this, will retain full direct oversight through the ILECs tariffs, and the tariff rates will be established based on each NG911 network provider's costs, plus an approved markup. In terms of actual delivery of NG911 services, ILECs through this framework were directed to establish their NG911 networks and to be ready to provide NG911 service, voice service rather, by 30th of June 2020, wherever PSAPs have been established in a particular region. So that was a fairly important caveat there. As well, TSPs, which for the context of this decision include telephone service providers that offer wireline and wireless local exchange telephone services, included local VoIP services as well. So the TSPs were directed to make the necessary changes on their networks to support NG911 voice throughout their operating territories by 30th of June 2020 as well, wherever the networks were technically capable of doing so, and wherever PSAPs had launched NG911 voice. The provision of NG911 voice is the foundation of the NG911 networks, and this would have marked the transition from the current system to the NG system as well, so the launch of NG911 voice. In terms of mobile wireless service providers, or WSPs as we call them, they were to provide RTT-based NG911 text messaging throughout their operating territories by 31st of December 2020, with similar conditions, so wherever the networks were capable of doing so, and wherever PSAPs had launched NG911 text messaging. So for our perspective, seeing as voice is going to be fairly transparent, the transition from legacy voice to NG911 voice will be fairly transparent for Canadians. We consider that NG911 text messaging based on RTT will be the first net new service that will be available to all Canadians, on which I'll touch on more on an upcoming slide as well. So the Commission took a transitory approach to NG911 implementation in that for a 3-year period until June 30th, 2023, NG911 and the current 911 networks would exist concurrently. On the 30th of June of 2023, the current 911 networks would be completely decommissioned. It is expected, though, that there may be still some service providers or PSAPs who will not have fully transitioned to NG911 after the decommissioning date. So that for that reason, the CRTC mandated that legacy gateways be employed to ensure, regardless of what flavor of 911 exists on a particular network or at a particular PSAP, all 911 calls are answered by a PSAP. Right. So we didn't want to cause a situation where we decommissioned legacy 911 and would therefore remove 911 service for a number of Canadians because the PSAP serving their area had not transitioned to the new service. So the framework also established obligations on Bell Canada and TELUS, who are two major ILECs and service providers in Canada, to undertake NG911 laboratory tests and to conduct NG911 voice implementation trials with PSAPs and TSPs in their respective operating territories. And further on, the framework also imposed new obligations related to reliability, security, privacy, and outage reporting. But given all this, just a little sidebar here, so keep in mind that the dates I just mentioned were established before the pandemic, but we'll discuss where we are at now in future slides here. Since the publication of this framework here, the Commission has published a number of additional decisions that augment and supplement the original framework, such as addressing the requirement to fund connections to all primary and secondary PSAPs through the NG911 tariffs. We added granularity as well to the NG911 text messaging technical specifications for WSPs. We set out new roles and responsibilities with respect to location information server and additional data repository functionality. We identified default GIS aggregators, and some of the direction as well was made to ensure that TSPs deliver to PSAPs the most accurate dispatchable location as well. So I've listed in some future slides at the end of the presentation in an appendix some of the decisions that followed through. So I won't go into them into detail here, but once the presentation is circulated, you'll have access to those as well. Okay, so just a brief snapshot here of the 911 network architecture and a bit of a situational awareness of what 911 looks like in Canada. So Canada covers approximately 9.985 million square kilometers and has a population of approximately 37.6 million. So for context, that's a population about half of that of Germany's, but spread over a landmass 28 times as large. So within the population here, most Canadians have access to enhanced 911, though an estimated 2% still only have access to basic 911. Another estimated 2% have no 911 service whatsoever, instead relying on local phone numbers to reach emergency services directly. So this occurs predominantly in more remote areas such as the north and certain areas on our eastern coast as well, where the population is less dense and where the 911 authorities have not established PSAPs. You can also see from this map that the country is divided among the three major 911 network providers, those being Bell, whose territory ranges from the east coast to central Canada, SaskTel, who operates within the province of Saskatchewan, and TELUS, who covers the western provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. So there's areas in the north as well. Those areas in the north that are limited to basic 911 or local emergency numbers fall mostly within Northwest TEL's territory. In fact, even some of the areas that have basic 911 in the north were only able to implement the service within the last couple of years, and this despite the roadmap for NG911 having been established a couple of years prior. So another key aspect I want to touch on for this particular slide here is that Canada has adopted a national strategy for NG911, and that the NG911 network in Canada will be comprised of 3 EZNets for the whole country, so one for each of the 3 911 network providers. And a special shout out to Bell Canada for providing this slide as well. This is their diagram here, so credit where credit is due. Okay, so as mentioned in a couple of slides before, Canada has adopted a transitory approach to NG911, meaning that there will be a period during which both the current 911 networks will exist, concurrent to NG911 networks. So this is a very high, obviously very high level slide here, but a few points that this slide helps illustrate is that on the E911 network, the responsibility for the automatic numbering information, or ANI, and the automatic location information, ALI, resides with the 911 network providers. In NG911, ALI and ANI will disappear and be replaced by the location information server, or the LIS, and the additional data repository, ADR, and the responsibility for these will reside with the TSPs. However, NG911 network providers have been mandated by the Commission to provide hosted LIS and ADR functionalities to those TSPs who prefer to go the hosted route. As well, during the transition, seeing as not all TSPs and PSAPs will move to NG911 at the same time, the Commission mandated NG911 network providers to implement legacy selective gateway routers, or LSRGs, as you can see on the slide here, in order to implement the translation of legacy traffic to NG911 traffic. So we recognize that some TSPs will simply not be technically capable of transitioning to an IP-based system. As such, once NG911 networks are in and 911 network providers begin decommissioning their basic and enhanced 911 networks, those TSPs will still be able to continue operating, but will require a legacy network gateway in order to interface with the NG911 network. Similarly, the Commission recognizes that PSAPs face a number of challenges with regards to moving to the newer system, and that not all PSAPs will have transitioned prior to the decommissioning. So they too have the option of implementing legacy PSAP gateways, though this approach is not really encouraged or recommended. But in both cases, for LNGs and LPGs, the responsibility for implementing these gateways, including funding them, will lie with the TSPs and PSAPs who require them respectively. So moving on to NG911 text messaging based on RTT, as we are currently calling it. So in addition to NG911 voice services, the Commission mandated in the NG911 Network framework that WSPs provide NG911 text messaging to their subscribers. So given that the move to voice will be fairly transparent to the average citizen, NG911 text messaging will be effectively the first net new service in the implementation of NG911 in Canada. There are a few preconditions to being able to actually employ the service though, so namely that the PSAP to which your NG911 call will be routed must be equipped to receive and exchange NG911 text messages with you. You must be in an area with voice over LTE coverage, so VoLTE coverage, and it must be an active feature on the device, meaning that the phone you are using is compatible with the service and has the proper functionality installed natively on the device as opposed to over the top, which is a way that I know that many other jurisdictions are doing it. So this is important for it to be natively installed, as the NG911 text messaging session will be treated as a wireless call, both in terms of how it's routed and for the location information. So assuming these conditions are met, the intent is for NG911 text messaging to be accessible to all Canadians. So in that sense, it's not intended to be a direct replacement for TTY in Canada. So speaking about location here, continuing with the theme of wireless service as well, the provisioning of local information for wireless 911 calls evolves from providing no location information on basic 911 service to providing detailed estimates of latitude and longitude of locations on 911 calls made by wireless handsets for enhanced 911 service. So this was done in stages and is reflected in key Commission decisions that resulted in Phase 1 location information being mandated in 2003, whereby location information for the call was based on the cellular tower location, followed by Phase 2 location information being mandated 6 years later in 2009, whereby the location of the call is based on the location of the calling telephone. So as important, along with the decisions related to the details of location to be provided on wireless 911 calls, the process for monitoring the accuracy of wireless location information was also mandated. So through this monitoring process, the Commission tracks wireless location accuracy on an annual basis and has seen continuous improvements in overall results since 2009. So with the implementation of Phase 1 and Phase 2 location technology, not only has the accuracy of locates improved substantially, but the percentage of location of accurate locates has increased from about 50% to about 75% of wireless 911 calls made in Canada. Further, with the implementation of handset location technology, we anticipate that the accuracy of locates will increase yet again, and that the percentage of accurate locates is anticipated to increase to about 90%. So there are currently 4 arenas in which improvements to location information from 911 services are being addressed. So with regards to wireless handset-based location technology implementation, the Emergency Services Working Group has made recommendations related to leveraging Apple and Google technologies to improve handset-based location information. For dispatchable location, we're exploring methods on how to best provide dispatchable location information from originating networks to the PSAPs to ensure that the first responders being dispatched to the site of emergency have the most accurate location information possible. In terms of addressing in GIS, which is looking at the creation of NG911 compliant GIS data models, it's also looking at the development of NENA i3-based civic addressing format within the Canadian context. And last but not least, geo-routing, which is looking at implementing the mechanisms to route calls to the appropriate PSAP based on geodetic information. So all 4 projects are closely interrelated with coordination managed by the ESWIG. Subgroups are in place within ESWIG, including representation from each initiative to assess cross impacts each project has on the others. All right, so far we've covered most of the Commission's intent with regards to NG911, from the strategic objectives to the framework, to the initiatives related to the improvement of location information. So I'm aware some of you are probably asking right now where we currently are. So as I mentioned earlier, our intent was to launch NG911 Voice in the summer of last year, but then COVID happened, as with the rest of the world, so we had to reassess things, seeing as the pandemic had a major effect on citizens and businesses, including those responsible for implementing NG911. So in terms of the current situation here and the effect that the pandemic had on us, so by the end of March of last year, it's fairly clear that 911 stakeholders were feeling the crunch of the pandemic, and that we understood that with respect to NG911, the maintenance of the current 911 networks was being prioritized over work related to the deployment of NG911. So in April of last year, the Commission proactively suspended all the deadlines established in the framework that I mentioned earlier. Work continued at ESWIG though, albeit at a lower cadence. So by late summer of 2020, people had more or less become accustomed to the new normal. So the Commission launched a notice of consultation in order to seek views from the public, including NG911 network providers, local and provincial governments, TSPs, PSAPs, and vendors. The record for the NOC closed in January, and the Commission is currently working on getting a decision out to establish new deadlines there. So notwithstanding, NG911 stakeholders continue to work towards the implementation of NG911, including carrying on with technical voice trials, finalizing core network, next generation network service infrastructure, and working through various other issues raised and discussed at ESWIG. So all this to say that we're trying to get back on track as much as possible, given the effects of the pandemic, which are ongoing, of course. But we're working on reestablishing the roadmap for NG911 for us to move forward with this. So the COVID pandemic aside, there have been a number of challenges we've encountered since we first set out to implement NG911. So I'll just take a few minutes here on our second to last slide to talk about some of the challenges and lessons learned. So with regards to standards, one of the challenges that we met has to do with the implementation being dependent on standard developing bodies and their development cycles. So, for example, when the Commission first announced that it would be adopting the EENA i3 standard for NG911, that standard was currently at version 1. At the moment, we're in between standards, as you might say, given that V2 is the current accepted standard, but V3 is in development and is nearly finalized. So this has led to some complications with regards to specifications to which the network will be built, as stakeholders want to move as quickly as they can to implement the system, but we don't want to have to implement massive changes down the road if that can be avoided. In addition, vendors want to ensure that they have a rock-solid standard to which they will develop their products, all the while creating something that can be exploited on the key American market as well. So this creates a challenge with respect to developing implementation timelines ahead of finalizing of key standards. So for so for example, standards for key RTT functionality, such as RTT callback, RTT bridging, are not yet finalized, and that's having an impact as well. There's also the question with respect to ensuring that standards reflect the Canadian landscape. I mentioned that in one of the previous slides here. So given that Canada has 2 official languages, English and French, there's a requirement for us to Canadianize USA-focused EENA i3 standards to fit the Canadian way of doing things, including having location information be available in both languages, as well as using Canadian terminology. So for example, changing the names of some of the fields in the standards. So whereas US has zip codes, for example, and states, Canada has postal codes and provinces and territories. So some of these minor adjustments need to be made so that we can exploit them as much as possible. So moving on to collaboration. So collaboration is key for an effective and uniform system. So the CISC ESWIG has been instrumental in the development of the NG911 implementation plan. So here, through CISC and ESWIG, we have a forum of experts who are often competitors in other contexts, right? But within ESWIG, they're all collaborating for the sole purpose of providing the best emergency communications network possible to Canadians. So from identifying and resolving technical and operational issues to ensuring national consistency, the collaboration between the 911 stakeholders is key and beyond beneficial. Further, while different aspects of implementing NG911 are defined in projects separately at first, it quickly becomes apparent that especially as projects come close to completion, that very close relationships exist between them, and comprehensive coordination is required to understand the cross impacts so they can be completed successfully. Lastly, time, right? Time is a major impact as well. So hindsight being 2020, there's been a realization that the time required for certain behind the scenes NG911 work was underestimated. So for example, industry has raised issues with regards to delays due to limited experience in IP network-to-network interconnection at the carrier level, as well as limited experience in IP networking, cybersecurity, encryption, DNS-based routing for the majority of stakeholders. So getting caught up on these aspects and understanding how they apply to the NG911 context takes time and should be planned for. And time is also required for effective testing of major functionalities and interoperability, of course. And there has to be clarity with respect to the exact purposes and scope of the trials. So in an effort to ensure that the next generation system is as effective as possible, it's easy to go overboard with the number of tests. At one point, we had somewhere close to 90,000 test cases, but with proper consultation and collaboration, that number was significantly whittled down. In addition to the complexity and high-level integration required between the equipment and vendors, it increased the complexity of the testing and time required to address arising issues as well. So make sure that you don't underestimate the time required to get to an effective product at the end. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation here. So to conclude, notwithstanding all the challenges that we just discussed, Canada is very proud of the progress that is made on this front, positioning itself as a leader in NG911 implementation, at least on a national scale, as we saw. We're also very proud of the great relationship and collaboration that exists between the Commission and 911 stakeholders. So if there's some key takeaways there, collaboration is key. I'm not sure what the landscape is in other jurisdictions, but if there's opportunity to come together in the type of form that we have here, I think that'd be, I would encourage everybody to do that to their own benefit. So on behalf of CRTC, I thank you for having given me your attention this morning. So my team and I will now take questions in the time remaining.
Thank you, Etienne. Merci beaucoup. Thanks for your very interesting presentation, and I'm sure there's a lot that we can take from that here in Europe. So we have a few minutes dedicated to questions. So I invite people who still have some doubts or clarifications needed, or just sharing some comments, to do so in the questions box. So feel free to share it, and then I will read it to Etienne, who is also joined by two of his colleagues to help responding to the question. So I already did. So two questions have been asked. The first one, Etienne or one of your colleagues, is are you collaborating with neighboring countries, but you have only one, actually, the United States, for cases of roaming? I don't know if Etienne or Milan or Joel, you want to take this question, but I think if you speak, you're muted, so.
Well, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry, the question was regards to, are we collaborating for the US for roaming cases? Is that the case?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a very good question at this time. I would say that we're monitoring it, but I don't think there's any current active. I mean, we are integrated. Sorry, we do collaborate with EENA from time to time. So, in regards to particular roaming cases at this point, And perhaps Milena or Joel can add to that, but as far as I know, there's been no firm talks currently on this that I can, not that I'm aware of in any case, but.
Hi, it's Milena here. If I could add to that, Etienne. So in terms of interconnecting the NG networks with the American networks, that is on our radar for further down the line. In terms of wireless roaming, there are certain areas right now where calls could be picked up, made in Canada, but picked up by a US tower, and there are local procedures in place to transfer those calls to the appropriate PSAP when that happens.
Okay. Thank you, Milan and Etienne. Then we have another question, actually about text messaging based on real-time text. So in Europe, such services are usually limited to a certain group of citizens. What were the reasons to extend this channel to all citizens?
So in terms of the reasoning, I mean, yeah, so currently we have, for particular communities, we have text with 911, and that requires registration, so it's only available to a certain number of individuals. So in regards to text with RTT, or NG911 text messaging based on RTT, so it's a new capability, right? So we wanted to ensure that all Canadians were able to benefit from NG911 and not just a particular community. So seeing it as, yeah, obviously you have the, as I mentioned, the particular preconditions to being able to access RTT. But in terms of, yeah, we just want to make sure that all Canadians were able to benefit from the invitation of next generation 911 equally. So we found that limiting that particular service to a key small group of people would be counter to that strategic objective of ours.
And if I could add to that, Etienne, one of the use cases that came up was how to provide a means for Canadians to request emergency assistance when it was not safe to speak or make noise. For example, one use case is for domestic violence. So it's to provide opportunities to reach for help when it's not safe to make a voice call.
And it's Joel here. Further to that, with respect to public communications, we do agree with the tack that the folks are using in the States. It's call if you can, text if you can't. We'll be promoting that as well. And so it'll fit right in for anybody at all.
Thank you for that. As you were speaking, Maria Jax, who worked at the 911 for the state of Maine in the US, actually just added a comment to the previous question about roaming, saying that there are actually local procedures in place between Maine and New Brunswick for roaming calls. So I guess there might be some local agreements actually. And I'll take one last. Yeah.
I was just going to make Joel McGrath here. Yeah. With respect to non-VoLTE calls, there are roaming agreements between Canadian and American carriers. However, with respect to VoLTE itself, there are, if not any, very limited number of agreements in place now. Those are about to be developed, though. Yeah,
I guess it will come in the next years. Thank you, Joel. And I'll take one last question, which is from Mario Castellano. So it's actually two questions. So one is, are you using satellite communications in the north regions that are not covered by 911? And the second question, are you looking to use satellite internet services?
So we just want to separate two things here. So there's the 911 network in Canada, and there's the originating network that individuals would subscribe to that would provide the gateway for 911. So there are communities in the north that do rely on satellite communications for their communications at large. So I mean there are limitations with that. Seeing that for most part, if you're using satellites, it would be for internet-based communications. So therefore, if you're communicating with 911, it might more be through VoIP, for example. And there are limitations with that service calling 911 through VoIP. So There's not currently 911 satellites for the dedicated purpose of 911, but for providing communications as a whole in general areas that don't have the infrastructure for for overall communications for certain communities. The second part of the question rather was, are we planning on using satellites for NG911? Is that correct?
Yeah.
So once again, I think for not as a dedicated aspect of NG911, if there are communities that will rely on satellite communications for the communications needs, then that would be integrated probably on more the originating network side. But those are fairly small. That'll be a small number of people, I think, that would have to rely on that form. Milen, Joel, anything to add on that particular case for satellites?
So for in the example of satellite phones, I know there are limitations in terms of accessing 911. In terms of communities that use satellite as backhaul, the bigger limitation, I think, is the establishment of PSAPs and emergency responders in those areas. But again, there's limitations. Now with the new new technologies that are coming up, it'll be interesting to assess, and I'm sure ESWIG will have recommendations on how they can be incorporated into our ecosystem, as for example, Starlink gets deployed. More to come in the future.
Yeah, it will be exciting to follow that. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your presentation and your answers afterwards. I think that's very interesting. Feel free for the others to continue asking questions. I see there's still some questions being asked, and then I can ask perhaps Etienne, Milen, and Joel if you can kindly answer to these questions in written, so that we can all see also the answer. But unfortunately, we are running out of time. We're already a bit late actually, so we'll continue a bit in the program. So thank you again, merci beaucoup. And we'll continue actually. So we were supposed to continue with a presentation from Cristina Lumbreras, Freddie McBride, and myself. However, I see that we are approaching the time of the coffee break already. So I suggest that we already have the coffee break now, and we take 18 minutes. We'll be back at 3:35 Brussels time, and then we can discuss on the next steps on NG112. Thank you.